Hello, everybody, and welcome to the final installment of the Spring 2022 Lyceum Student Speaker Series. My name is Emily Bowling.
My name is Louise Frankie, and tonight we both have the privilege of introducing Miss Meredith Johnson.
If you're wondering why there are two of us, don't worry, we can explain.
One person could never convey just how remarkable Meredith Johnson truly is.
Her resume is certainly impressive. She's a Lyceum Scholar studying political science, communications, and philosophy. Last summer, she completed the Hudson Institute Political Studies Fellowship, where she spent 6 weeks in Washington, D.C., studying the theory and practice of politics. Additionally, she was recently awarded a Fulbright Scholarship, ETA, to the Slavic Republic. But perhaps most reflective of Meredith's serious tenacity is her role as the founding editor-in-chief of the Orantayako.
Within only 8 months' time, Meredith orchestrated the creation, establishment, and successful production of Clemson's first ever undergraduate journal for the humanities and social sciences. Thanks to her guidance, diligence, and commitment to Clemson University, Meredith has left a legacy of serious scholarship and appreciation for the humanities community here on campus.
Tonight, Meredith's scholarship will be on full display as she presents her thesis on Nietzsche's gay science. Over the past year, she has worked tirelessly on her thesis, reading aphorism after aphorism, covering topics spanning from the will to truth to the transcendent value of art, with an effervescence that only Meredith possesses.
Having had the immense privilege of calling Meredith both an interlocutor and a best friend, I can confidently say that this unique liveliness carries itself through every conversation, every late-night writing session, and every tiny moment of togetherness. She is earnest, kind, and dedicated to willing herself to the truth of the will to truth at all costs.
That's so true, Louise. In fact, I was actually going to describe Meredith as sincere, caring, and relentlessly pursuant of the will to truth. But since that's already been said, Louise, I guess I can share how incredibly supportive Meredith is. When a friend is in need, Meredith is always ready to fix things however she can. And when things prove unfixable, she is always there to offer her love, support, and most of all, humor to make a problem seem small.
Well, I suppose we should let Meredith's presentation speak for itself then. Tonight, she will be discussing with us Nietzsche's thought concerning modern man as contained within the gay science, with particular attention to themes of the psychology of modern man, his new understanding of metaphysics, and the role of art.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming Ms. Meredith Johnson.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much to Emily and Louise for that lovely introduction. That was better than I could have imagined it would be. I would also be remiss if I didn't give a few thanks out before starting my remarks today. I want to thank the Lyceum program for giving me the best education I could have asked for at Clemson University over these past 4 years. I want to thank my thesis advisor, Dr. J. Michael Hoffpower, my mentor, Dr. Adam Michael Thomas, and all of my friends who have been so supportive to me through my endeavor this past year. Now on to my remarks. Today, I will be giving a talk entitled On Nietzsche's The Gay Science, How Modern Man May Come to Understand Himself. Published in 1887, The Gay Science, which can be equally translated to The Joyous Wisdom, is the work hailed by Nietzsche himself to be the most personal of all of his books. Consisting of 5 books and written aphoristically, or in small, divided, and numbered sections, this work lays the groundwork for man's psychological understanding within the modern context. It is also within this work that Nietzsche's most famous proclamation is made, the announcement that God is dead and we have killed him. However, this talk is not guided by questions into the investigation of what Nietzsche truly means when he says that God is dead, however legitimate such an exploration may be. Today, if you will allow me, let us take Nietzsche's proclamation of the death of God on good faith, assuming its truth within modernity. Therefore, let us take the problems posed by this realization, which Nietzsche admits are gravely serious, as being personally important for our own lives and our own ability to live. Therefore, the guiding question of this talk today will be, put succinctly, how can man live after the death of God? In a more judicious phrasing, this talk will be guided by the question of if man's psychological understanding of himself can affirm his own life after the death of God. Thus, for Nietzsche and for our own purposes today, the standard by which value judgments will be weighed is man's ability to affirm his own life. In order to examine this question more fully, we must explore its origin, its created problems, and future solutions. Therefore, Aphorism 153 of the Gay Science will serve as the central focus of today's talk. This aphorism offers us a new perspective through which we may view ourselves and thus affirm our own ability to live following the death of God. Entitled Homopoleta, Latin for man is poet, or for our purposes today, the poetic man, this aphorism offers the men of modernity a new modern perspective through which we may affirm life itself. If you will allow me, I would like to take you step by step through the 8 lines of Aphorism 153 to uncover what we may learn from Nietzsche's diagnosis of our own psychological disposition. 4 other aphorisms throughout the gay science will be utilized in order to further illuminate the ideas contained within the one aphorism which has been passed out to you today. However, the central focus of the talk remains how we can live following the death of God. Now, let us turn to Aphorism 153 before you. Before we read aloud the first sentence, let's take a note of a few key details regarding the aphorism in its entirety. First, the aphorism is contained within quotation marks, meaning these words are not being said directly by Nietzsche himself. If you will skim through the aphorism, you will see references to tragedy, the 4th act, and the 5th act. These terms lead me to interpret this aphorism as being spoken by a self-aware actor on a stage within a play. Thus, the title of the aphorism, Poetic Man, is represented within the structure of the aphorism itself. The one speaking is its titular character. He is the poetic man. Thus, he looks at life through an artistic and an aesthetic perspective, not a moral or a scientific one, as us moderns may be accustomed to. Now, let us take a look at the first line of the aphorism. It reads, quote, I myself, having made this tragedy of tragedies all by myself, insofar as it is finished. From this line alone, what does this actor understand about himself? First, this line tells us the man has created his own personal tragedy by himself. For our purposes, a Greek tragedy will be defined as a play in which the protagonist falls to disaster through his own personal failing with which he cannot deal. Not only has this actor experienced a tragedy, but it is the tragedy of all tragedies, the greatest of which has ever been known. This actor understands himself to be the protagonist of his own life, who has brought about disaster via his own creation. Thus, he is the creator, the enactor, and the debtor of his own tragic creation. Now, what could Nietzsche be referring to in these lines? What would serve as the great tragedy which has led to man's destruction? The best illumination on this question is found within Aphorism 125, the madman. It is within this Aphorism 125 of the gay science that Nietzsche proclaims the death of God, and he frames man's loss of God as a psychological loss of his own creation. Aphorism 125 takes place in a timeless and a nameless town, wherein a madman is seen to light a lantern and run straight into the midst of a town while exclaiming, I seek God, I seek God. This exclamation provokes much laughter from the townspeople, and they ask the madman where God could have possibly gone. The madman then turns their questions around onto them, asking, whither is God? I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. The madman's words are shocking at first. He proclaims not simply the death of God, but the murder of him, and he implicates us in his crime. Exemplified through the madman's first question following this grave proclamation, but how did we do this? Nietzsche reveals how deeply personal, close, and grand this accusation weighs upon our feelings of conscience. The first question which comes to mind is not why, but how did we commit such an act? Therefore, the recognition of the deed having already been done and the ownership of responsibility is implicit in the madman's question. Instead of contemplating further how this could even be possible, the madman begins to express a seemingly deteriorating psychological state as the weight of this event's implications bear down upon him. The madman reflects the frenzied mental state one feels when he experiences the loss of complete purpose and the oncoming feeling of futility. He asks, are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Nietzsche prompts us to wonder, has man lost the ability to have purpose forever? Does the death of God necessarily imply nothingness for all men and for all time? The madman serves as a mirror to us. As we see him demonstrate the psychological loss of belief through his recognition of his own lack of belief, the madman is he who has both experienced a tragedy and created that tragedy himself. Thus, the meaning of the first line of Aphorism 153 is illuminated through the parable of the madman. The death of God is the tragedy of all tragedies to which this poetic man refers. It has gravely serious consequences for man's ability to live because we have murdered that which gave man's life purpose, namely, the belief in the existence of God. Yet, because man has created the destruction himself, because he was the one who has murdered God, he is the one who has also murdered purpose. Thus, the actor, our poetic man on the stage of 153, fully affirms this about himself. He is in full cognizance, not frenzied questioning, of the fact that he has made the tragedy of tragedies all by himself. Now, let us move on to the second sentence of Aphorism 153. The actor then says, quote, I, having first tied the knot of morality into existence, before I drew it so tight that only a God could untie it, end quote. The poetic man knows that he brought about the death of God and that he brought about the existence of morality as well. However, this claim is certainly puzzling at first glance. Do we really think that man tied the knot of morality into existence himself? Aphorism 343, entitled The Meaning of Our Cheerfulness Within the Gay Science, helps further our understanding of how man could have, and in fact did, create morality, and consequently posited God as the source of this morality. Nietzsche begins Aphorism 343 with the same scene from whence our previous aphorism of interest left off, 125, the madman. Nietzsche lays the death of God out in explicit terms, saying, quote, the greatest recent event that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, end quote. Nietzsche supplies further substantiation of the nature of the death of God, which was initially laid out in Aphorism 125, namely that it is a psychological phenomenon of man. He says, quote, the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, end quote. We should take care with what understanding of the death of God Nietzsche is offering here. It seems that if we wanted to hold onto our belief in the Christian God or in any gods, it would be impossible. But why? Nietzsche tells us that our ability to possess belief is no longer possible. Aphorism 343 explains that it was our own disbelief which has killed God. But taken into context with Aphorism 125, the death of God can now be understood to not be a fictionalized death, which would leave the possibility of a revival open, but that it is the death and the belief of an anthropomorphized figure. If God was principally always just a construct of man's own mind, man's psychological ability to believe in God would entail the final, ultimate, and eternal end of God himself. Thus, in order for a man to kill God, as the madman claims, and as the poetic man believes, he also had to have been God's own creator. Thus, when man believed in God, he willed him into existence. The existence of God, regardless that it was humanly constructed, created a system of morality in accordance with this belief. Therefore, as man created God, he too created God's own morality. Returning to the poetic man, we see that he fully understands the implications of the death of God. He knows that he has created morality, posited God as the source of this morality, and caused the destruction of which through his own creation and his lack of belief. So, now let us recollect all we have learned regarding the poetic man's perspective of himself. First, he is the creator of his own tragedy, meaning his own destruction has been brought about via his own will. Secondly, this tragedy which poetic man created is the murder of God. The destruction currently facing man now, the poetic man, is his own inability to affirm his own life. Now, let us turn to the third sentence proclaimed by the poetic man in Aphorism 153. He says, quote, I myself have now slain all gods in the fourth act for the sake of morality, end quote. Poetic man seemingly claims that the tragic murder of God was done for the sake of morality. Is the poetic man really suggesting that the murder of God, which ostensibly has ended all morality forever, was done so for the sake of that which it destroyed? Turning to Aphorism 344 of the Gay Science, entitled How We Too Are Still Pious, Nietzsche offers an account of the exact nature of our psychological disposition, which previously has propped up our belief in God and has now lent itself to the destabilization of its own foundation. Nietzsche attempts to uncover what perspective lies at the heart of modern men. He determines that it is deep psychological attachment to truth. Man expresses to himself the belief that, quote, nothing is needed more than truth, and in relation to it, anything else has only second-rate value, end quote. This belief in truth expands beyond a mere faith, however, into what Nietzsche terms as man's unconditional will to truth. Nietzsche says man's attachment to truth is not just a belief, but an unconditional willing of it into existence. However, Nietzsche inquires what this will to truth means for man's psychological understanding in relation to himself. Nietzsche urges us to recognize the psychological implications of man's unconditional will to truth, that he cannot live without truth. Yet, Nietzsche calls this question into perspective, and resultantly, he moves to examine that which truly may benefit life, whether it is truth or deception, or perhaps both. he offers a definitive answer, asserting that both truth and untruth have constantly been proven to be useful for man. Let us turn to the example of modern science, which says that truth alone is useful. Nietzsche argues that science has arisen despite this utility which exists in both truth and untruth. Despite the value which man may find in untruth, man continues to will truth at any price. Nietzsche explains the gravely serious consequences of our unconditional will to truth. He says, quote, "How well we understand these words once we have offered and slaughtered one faith after another upon this altar," end quote. Our will to truth can overturn any faith which it claims to be true, as it can be so only on a provisional basis. In the pursuit of that final discovery, absolute truth, any knowledge which man holds today can be proven false if another discovery is made tomorrow. Therefore, nothing in this understanding of truth can ever be absolutely true. Therefore, man's will to truth is incoherent at its core. Man continuously allows deception regarding his own standard of belief to persist, that standard that anything, even that which is true today, can be false tomorrow. Yet, the man of science continues to say, quote, "I will not deceive, not even myself, and with that we stand on moral ground," end quote. Nietzsche has fully uncovered the contradictory basis of our will to truth, that man must deceive himself that he is the one positing that the existence of a truth, that man must deceive himself that he is the one positing the existence of a truth which may never be fully obtained. Therefore, Nietzsche diagnoses man's metaphysical understanding as, quote, "something more serious, namely a principle that is hostile to life and destructive, will to truth that might be concealed a will to death," end quote. Deception can hold equally as much of a role in man's value as does truthfulness. Thus, life affirmation cannot be achieved through the pursuit of truth alone. The affirmation of another world other than life, nature, and history is assailed by Nietzsche as being metaphysically nihilistic. Science ultimately holds a moral view that truth has more value than man's ability to live. Nonetheless, the moral principle which first created belief in truth has eventually been revealed via scientific discovery to be not moral. Somehow, the pursuit of our moral end has led to an immoral conclusion. Consequently, Nietzsche attacks this metaphysical faith upon which our faith in science rests. At bottom, modern man's godless faith still advances belief in a truth which exists outside of the realm of human perception. Nietzsche attributes the source of modern atheistic science all the way to the creation of our belief in God. He says, quote, "that even we seekers after knowledge today, we godless anti-metaphysicians, still take our fire too from the flame lit by a faith that is thousands of years old, that Christian faith, which was also the faith of Plato, that God is truth, that the truth is divine," end quote. While modern man may purport himself to be old of all old religiosity, his understanding of how he should live still takes its basis from the same metaphysical understanding which Plato invented with the forms and took its formulation in Christianity, the belief in an otherworldly truth. What has been brought about through modernity is not man's nihilism, but the recognition of the nihilism inherent within the will to truth itself. Thus, we have reached the heart of the Poetic Man's claim, quote, "I have slain all gods in the fourth act for the sake of morality," end quote. We are able to see these consequences most clearly through the invention of modern science and its subsequent destruction of God. Our morality today, even though scientific, is still the pursuit of truth. We still believe in the divinity of truth. In the modern context, this has propped up the development of the scientific disciplines. Yet, the realization brought to modern men through scientific discovery is that there is no otherworldly source of truth. Thus, the death of God reveals that a truth as existing outside the realm of human perception cannot exist. Science, which posits the morality of truth, just as religion used to, has been undermined by its own discovery of the untruth of God. So, now let us turn back to Aphorism 153 and see if the Poetic Man can show us where to go now. He has shown us where man has been from the first to the fourth acts, from his creation of God, God's own morality, and his destruction of such through his pursuit of truth. Yet, the guiding question of this talk still stands. How can man live following the death of God? The last three sentences of Aphorism 153 read, quote, "Now, what is to become of the fifth act? From where am I to take this tragic solution? Should I begin to think about a comic solution?" Poetic Man offers a suggestion to us, not a definitive answer, but something from which man may begin to think about in order to move beyond the death of God, namely a comic solution. A Greek comedy here is being defined as a play which is a representation of laughable people and involves some kind of blunder or ugliness which does not cause pain or disaster. As opposed to the deadly serious destruction which arises from tragedy, Poetic Man urges us to think about a comedic perspective through which we can affirm the fullness of life. In a way that a tragedy could not, a comedy could inspire man to affirm even the bad, immoral, and sad parts of life through laughter. Even with all of its blunders, errors, and untruths, life may still be endurable for man if he does not take these things too seriously. Thus, let us turn to Aphorism 107 of the Gay Science, entitled Our Ultimate Gratitude to Art, so that we may examine a potential solution which Nietzsche offers, the aesthetic phenomenon brought about through man's creative will. The aphorism opens with a definition of what the arts are. Nietzsche calls them, quote, a kind of cult of the untrue, end quote. As opposed to the morality of truth implicit in both religion and science, art does not attempt to hide the untruth of life by positing a metaphysical truth elsewhere. And we know that this positing of metaphysical truth is no longer possible after the death of God. Thus, man needs a new perspective through which he may affirm his own life, and one in which will not fall prey to the same problems of science and morality. Therefore, a lens through which man may view the entirety of his life in recognition of both untrue and true is necessary for his ability to live. Nietzsche says that our psychological realization of the general untruth has caused the direst consequences for man. It has ended his own ability to bear his existence. He writes, quote, then the realization of general untruth and mendaciousness that now comes to us through science, the realization that delusion and error are conditions of human knowledge and sensation would be utterly unbearable, end quote. Just as was explained in the discussion of the Poetic Man in the fourth act, untruth, as much as truth, is a condition of the human knowledge of life. Nietzsche attributes to art the ability to make existence bearable because it allows man to affirm the fullness of life. Art ultimately is a production of man's creative will, and it can represent a truth and an untruth, a morality and an immorality, in whichever way the artist sees fit. Nietzsche writes, quote, as an aesthetic phenomenon, existence is still bearable for us, and art furnishes us with eyes and hands, and above all, the good conscience to be able to turn ourselves into such a phenomenon, end quote. Art offers man these eyes and hands, the necessary tools for which man can create his own value in the world. Nietzsche then says, quote, precisely because we are at bottom grave and serious human beings, really more weights than human beings, nothing does us as much good as a fool's cap. We need all exuberant, floating, dancing, mocking, childish, and blissful art, lest we lose the freedom above things that our ideal demands of us, end quote. In short, Nietzsche says we take things too seriously because we are at bottom grave and serious human beings. Thus, we require a fool's cap, which allows us to view ourselves as a fool, as someone who can take all that comes to them lightly. The aesthetic phenomenon provides us with the ability to dance, to sing, to laugh between whatever contradictory realities we may place value in. Life is not independent of the human will of creation. Thus, man must be able to oscillate between whatever truths he must posit through his creative will. The fool's cap allows man to not take this contradiction, this untruth of life seriously, because he knows that he is the inventor of it all. The subjectivity of life necessitates lightness, liberation, and laughter for man's ability to live. Therefore, a perspective of modern man which promotes his ability to live could be a comedic one in which the error, the blunder, and the untruth of life may be taken with a good conscience. Finally, let us turn back to the central aphorism at hand, 155, Poetic Man. Through the four moves, the four acts, Nietzsche's Poetic Man has offered us a lens through which we may view ourselves as having both created value and the error within such value. As opposed to the moral lens, which leads to a feeling of futility after the death of God, a comedic solution offers man the ability to affirm his own life via his creative will. As an actor on the stage, the Poetic Man of Aphorism 153 has offered us an artistic template by which we can view the fullness of life, our own error and our own positing of value alike, as all being creations of our own will. The poetic man has turned himself into an aesthetic phenomenon by framing his own psychological understanding of his life through the medium of the theater. Brought into modernity by the death of God, man is now in his fifth act, and a question still remains: how are we to live? Through the example of the poetic man, we as moderns may come to understand ourselves as leaving behind the moral perspective in favor for an aesthetic one. While this is presented by Nietzsche as being a potential solution and not the solution, the aesthetic phenomenon is valuable as it promotes man's ability to live through its recognition of the value in error and its affirmation of man as the creator of value itself. Thank you. I'll take questions now. Will?
Can you explain a little bit more why it's necessary for men to have created God in order to kill God? Like, I can kill a grasshopper, but I didn't make a grasshopper.
Yeah, so I think that the understanding of who God is the answer to that, right? If God is the creator of all, if he's the creator of the universe, creator of everything, is it possible for you to kill everything that exists? If you killed God and he was the creator of you, then you would in turn die as well, correct? So if Nietzsche kills God, he first just has to be a creation of our own will and mind in order to fully kill him. Therefore, God was never actually a God over it all. He was always the positing of value. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Emily.
My question is, if a huge flaw of our creation of morality, if that's the proper way to speak of it, would be like sourced from the Greeks, right? In what way are we avoiding the same problems by returning to them, by like speaking in the language of like tragedy?
So I think that saying the Greeks is a little too specific. I think that the one understanding that Nietzsche advances is Platonic Forms as being the conception of all of this, right? The idea that goodness and truth exist somewhere else other than the world, which informs the value for man in life. And so if you look at things like Greek tragedy or Greek comedy, they don't necessarily have that same understanding. They can have different understandings of man's value or creation in life. They don't necessarily have to be Platonic, I would say. So I think that that's why we can still talk about it in these terms. Dr. Thomas?
Following up on the comedy and tragedy thing, you mentioned at the beginning that there's quotation marks around this, which that leads to the question of whether Nietzsche has a kind of distance on this in some way. He famously wrote the work of tragedy and seemed very interested in tragedy. So is there a kind of distance that you see in this comic solution from Nietzsche's point of view? Is something problematic about it, or how do you sort of see it?
There definitely is an element of distance implicit within this aesthetic phenomenon. If you were to go and look at 107, Our Ultimate Gratitude to Art, which I talked about in the last move, he talks about looking at things from an artistic distance. He says things such as laughing over morality. He says that art gives us the ability to laugh or weep over ourselves. So there is this element of almost self-removal from a problem that allows you to have this aesthetic phenomenon. Whereas something, if you take the example of morality makes everything personal and super close to you, right? Things that happen to you in life, they're all looked at through this lens that is super personal and close to you. Looking at things through an aesthetic phenomenon kind of gives you a little bit of distance to where you may view things as being separate from yourself, but also still tied to you in some way. I don't know if that answers your question, Dr. Thomas, but.
Is something sort of wrong with that? Distancing?
Total distancing would be wrong. There's a middle ground, right? He says that we laugh over morality, not that we remove ourselves from it completely. We laugh over ourselves. We don't disassociate ourselves from where we are. I'm not exactly sure where the middle ground is, but it's not complete involvement and it's not complete removal. It seems to be somewhere in the middle. Dr. Pierce.
So then who killed God? Was it us and our scientific legions, or was it the Homopoleta?
I'm not sure that we can't be the Homopoleta, and so in that sense, I don't know if drawing a distinction between who we are and who he is would be exactly a clear delineation, because what I advance through this talk is that Homopoleta does exist separate from ourselves, but he is teaching us how we can now basically become him, right? We can become the aesthetic man, the poetic man. And he says that he killed God himself. If we can become him, then, it would be everyone, I would say. I don't think it's necessarily a distinction there. Luca.
When you said to kill God requires that we have made him, it reminded me of something my mother would say to me, which is, I brought you into this world so I could take you out.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
But in reality, my mother would never take me out of this world because that would be too much for her, because she loves what she had created.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems that it's inevitable that we have killed what we created, God. But does Nietzsche say that we should approach this with a joy or sort of like sadness? What is the connotation of this murder? Is it something to be excited for? Is it bad? And why? I guess why? I have a sense of this, but why did we do it? Why did we kill what we created?
So it depends on which perspective you're looking at the death of God through. If you're thinking of it through a moral, scientific, religious perspective, just as I talked about the madman, this is obviously gravely serious, right? It ends our ability to have purpose. It ends our ability to affirm our own life. It ends our desire to even keep on living, right? If we look at it through this moral perspective. So in that sense, Nietzsche does recognize that that is true, right? That we are men of morality, we are men of science. And so if we hear the death of God, this is gravely serious to us. This is extremely saddening. This is extremely depressing. But if you look at it through another perspective, such as the aesthetic phenomenon that I've advanced, this can be something that is good for us, right? Something I didn't touch on in my talk today, but it is in my larger part of my thesis, is the aphorism, the meaning of our cheerfulness. And Nietzsche actually does argue that the death of God ultimately for philosophers and for free spirits is a good thing because it has liberated us from morality itself. And I could go into all the reasons why morality is bad for us, but I'll just let my talk stand for today and just say that it depends on which perspective you look at it through, but for Nietzsche's perspective, it is a cheerful thing. Yeah. Louise.
You spoke about Aphorism 343, how we too are still pious. And I'm curious if, following the conclusion of your talk, there's any sort of piety left with the comedic solution. What can we do with, can we talk about piety? Does it have a role?
So I think that the 344, how we too are still pious, is really meaning how we are still beholden to the divinity of truth. And that is the way in which Nietzsche is framing this pious talk, right? It means that we will truth unconditionally. We hold it as our God, either through religion, through Platonism, through Christianity, all the way to science. And so this piety that he's talking about is something that's gone. The death of God has killed this piety to truth. Where we could have piety now, in a certain sense, I mean, that would beg the question of what would be God in the modern context if we have something to be pious to, and I don't think that that possibility is happening anymore unless we, maybe perhaps if we were to affirm ourselves as the God, which we could be pious to in some certain way, but the piety there is the ultimate divinity of truth, which is gone now. So if you have a follow-up, then, I mean, I don't know if I answered your question is what I mean.
That was great.
Okay. Emily.
I have another question. Could you maybe explain how fits in with the title of the gay science?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what is the gay science? How does this relate?
Yes, that's a great question. So if we look at the end of my talk and we think about what the aesthetic phenomenon offers to us, what is Nietzsche really advancing here? And as I said at the beginning of my talk, the standard is man's ability to live, right? And so the reason that science and religion have been bad for us this whole time is because they inhibited our ability to live. Now, Nietzsche doesn't say, though, that life is untruth or that life is error. He says that life is as much error as it is truth and untruth and blunder and all of these things together, right? And so trying to boil down, not that you did this, but trying to boil down existence into like still a moral perspective is completely gone, right? And so I would say that I kind of forgot the beginning of your question now.
Just stick with the end, because that was just building up.
Okay, so a perspective through which we can affirm our lives now is one in which does not posit only truth or only untruth, but somehow, I remember your question now, but somehow dances between the two, right? And this dancing and this singing and this laughing that I referred to is the kind of movements that we need to make in order to affirm life through all of the different necessary value creations that we make. And so the gay science is kind of Nietzsche, it's also translated as the joyous wisdom, right? It's knowledge of man's ability to live joyfully or happily or cheerfully. And so these maneuvers between the errors and the truth and all of these things that we create is for Nietzsche the gay science, is our ability to live happily or cheerfully. Dr. Hofbauer.
Can you talk to us a little bit about why you think we ought to choose life over the alternative?
Mm-hmm.
And then in addition to this, is that value of why life is choice-worthy merely a product of will, or does it too come from without, like these old religions?
So ultimately, that is Nietzsche's purpose, right? To prove to us why we should choose life. And why does he need to prove it to us? Because essentially we have to will ourselves to that, is what I would say. You do have to will yourself to affirm your own life. There is not anything else that gives you that purpose any longer. And so, all of his works have essentially been a long-range argument into proving to us why we should choose to pursue life itself and not its alternative of death. And so ultimately that is, at the end of the day, a willing to choose life, but I mean, Nietzsche would be in full recognition of his willing, of his own affirmation of life. He wouldn't deny that he is willing the affirmation of life itself, but he would say, I tried to prove that it is choice-worthy to you through all of my work.
Has he proven it to you?
Yes. Yes.
Where should we start, in your opinion, to get it proven to ourselves?
Can you explain that more?
Where should we start reading to get it proven? Like, where should we start reading, in your opinion?
In the gay science?
In general.
Well, I would say that in order to get it proven to you, you have to believe that it's not in the first place, right? And so I would say, from my own getting to do this thesis was reading the genealogy of morals in your class in freshman year and political theory. And so kind of where, I don't know where we should start reading, but I'll just tell you where I started reading, which was the genealogy of morals. And it was kind of that discussion of slave and master morality, which really got my thinking on Nietzsche's thought, is taking it really seriously, right? The difference between life affirmation and life denial. And so it was really that which gripped me, which has led me to where I am now. So I guess I would say start reading there if you've never read anywhere before, but don't stop reading there. Keep reading. Abby.
I don't know if this is entirely relevant, so you don't have to speak on it if you don't want to, but I also just had a senior presentation today where, I talked a lot about Russia in it, and I'm wondering if you kind of see this phenomenon playing out in like the Bolshevik Bolshevik Revolution as like an example of will to power. This God, like religion was literally killed in the Soviet Union, and like, would you say that like the will to power took the place of morality? And like, with that, where do you see like room for emotional outlet as the aesthetic phenomenon, even if you're somewhere where the will to power is the like overarching morality? Is there still room for that aesthetic phenomenon through like literature or ballet or something like that?
So I guess what I would say is that I haven't advanced the will to power as such. I've advanced a very specific understanding of the aesthetic phenomenon, which is the creation of value. Nietzsche terms it as man's goodwill to appearance, is what he calls art in this aesthetic phenomenon. It's not exactly his will to power, which is why I've been a little bit careful at the end to say that this is a potential solution and not the potential solution for Nietzsche, right? So I honestly can't speak on the Bolshevik Revolution. I just genuinely am not knowledgeable enough on that to say that up here.
I guess more generally, do you think, like, do you see the aesthetic phenomenon not only as like taking the place of morality, but as an emotional outlet?
If you view
Instead of like the religion.
If you view man as having a need to have a purpose, morality serve that purpose, and the aesthetic phenomenon can serve as a purposeful life for man now, yes. Dr. Pierce.
So then following up, what is your reflection of the joyous science, the joyful knowledge, the joyful way of being is calling us to, I recall one phrase from the book, kick up your heels, people, and so on, and the dancing and the laughing and the sort of foolishness, I suppose. The new science is a form of foolishness. So then, do you have any sense of how he expects or what one should think of bringing it to bear on our daily actual lives? That you talked about some of these things in the earlier lectures. What should one do if one sees his point that we sort of live in a gloomy, doomy, boring, oppressive sort of downer, bummer world, and we should not feel that way about the world. We should feel that life is a gift and kick up our heels. So, I mean, I guess people find their own response to that by doing different things in their own way, but obviously we haven't, the joyous way of knowing or living hasn't taken over the world, but taken over our community, and people smiling and enjoying just being here. Yeah.
So your central question is though how we can implement this into our own lives.
Don't you think that people, there's a kind of, Tocqueville said it years ago, there's a kind of gloomy, negative scowl on the ordinary person's, an anxiety factor that they have that an observer like him can pick up on anyway when he's walking around, but obviously Nietzsche, that's what the joyous science is meant to cure, get over. So is it, my sense of it would be more like a form of anarchism, where you would just, more like the yippies and that kind of stuff, where you just go crazy all over the place. Sometimes, obviously in those days, under stimulants and illegal substances, but that you've got to keep being kind of wild and crazy to follow the call to the, I mean, maybe that's a dead end, I'm just saying, but how do people of your generation see the future in this respect?
Yeah, so I think to that what I would say is that this gay science and this joyous wisdom does necessitate a little bit of wildness, like you said, right? It necessitates, like I said, dancing and laughing and singing over things such as ourselves and over things such as morality, but it's not done for its own sake. As in, it's not anarchism for anarchism's sake, right? Saying that this joyous wisdom is essentially a liberation from morality is true, but then saying that we should pursue immorality for immorality is still a moral lens with which we would put on the liberation from morality, right? So this joyous wisdom is a complete liberation from morality, from our kind of necessity to use that, but it's not immorality for immorality's sake. It's kind of whatever is necessary for the creation of value and the affirmation of life in the moment. And you wouldn't do something harmful or immoral or something like that just for the sake of doing it. You would do it because it affirmed life or was in accordance with this joyous wisdom in some way.
Yeah, one phrase from the old days that way before your time. Should I wear a flower in my hair?
If that made you happy. Oh, I'm sorry, Dr. Daniels.
So if we take Nietzsche at his word and embrace this transcendence, right? As I think he says, to sort of use art as the way to escape nausea and suicidal thoughts. You know, that the kind of dead end of the essentialism that was represented by our creation of God, the belief in a kind of rootedness of truth, that to pursue merely the old way of doing things with the knowledge that it's lost its foundation would give us this unease, this sense that he kind of describes the modern. But what then do you see the implications of this transcendence and embrace of the joyous approach to community, to how we order our affairs when without any kind of grounding there are, you know, I mean, if Dr. Pierce's sense of joyousness is different from others, how do we order our communities and live in a political arrangement with this kind of anti-foundationalism that he sort of says, like, it's all off. If we only take that, it's just nausea and suicide, and we don't want that. We want to affirm life. But how do we do that in community when that affirmation is going to take radically different forms?
So this is the point at which Nietzsche becomes a political philosopher, right? This is the point at which the kind of overarching divinity of truth, which is democratized truth down to each individual, suddenly becomes unbearable for us, right? And it's actually not even unbearable, but it's against life itself in the way that you've described. And so this formulation of Nietzsche's thought is an attack on democracy and things like that, right? It's an attack on Christianity and democracy. As of what it would look like after, I don't know exactly the type of political foundation that it would take. I don't even know if one of our modern formulations of political foundation would inhibit this type of radical individualism that is created through this affirmation of life. But it wouldn't look anything like we have today. And in Aphorism 343, the meaning of our cheerfulness, Nietzsche talks about the destruction of all of European morality as well as kind of the political foundations that we have propped up underneath this morality. So you're right that it would collapse everything that we have right now, but as of what it would look like, I mean, it would have to be individualistic, and it would have to be radically life-affirming. Reese.
So you said at the beginning, let's just suppose that God is dead, and we're going to kind of take Nietzsche's word for it, and we're going to kind of use life affirmation as kind of the standard for whether or not something is good for us or not. Let's say that we didn't take that to be the case, and that we still wanted to hold on to our morality, and that we thought this all kind of sounded crazy. Is there something about the aesthetic phenomenon that we can kind of, incorporate, or maybe that can enrich our lives if we haven't moved past the divinity of truth, or is the aesthetic phenomenon completely incompatible in any world or for any person who still wants to hold on to the divinity of truth or morality as we've kind of traditionally conceived it?
So I would say that the loss, in particular, I'm going to talk about science and not necessarily morality in response to your question, but if we look at Nietzsche's kind of diagnosis of science, he doesn't completely destroy the scientific development. He just says that it's not really life-affirming and that it can't be all that there is, right? So things such as the pursuit of science, morality, they could be their own value creations, just as we see fit, but they wouldn't be the end-all be-all for Nietzsche. And so what you said, if we can take the aesthetic phenomenon into our own lives today, I don't know if you held a strictly moral perspective, then I don't think that you could, right? But if you kind of moderated your own morality, but then that would detract from the moral perspective itself. So I think at the end of the day, it's not actually applicable. Yeah. Dr. Thompson.
Two questions for you, Meredith. First, how does Nietzsche understand, even define what truth and beauty are? And how does he understand the relationship between them? That's question one. Question two is, in your view, is Nietzsche's philosophy both true and beautiful?
Okay, so for the first question, truth by Nietzsche is defined within the context of how we understand truth, right? Which is a metaphysical existence of something that is true and therefore good for us here on earth. So what that means is that truth is some formulation of the good which exists outside of our realm, outside of our human perception, which informs how we should live our lives. That's how we understand truth, and that's how Nietzsche talks about truth, right? That in the way that we understand it. He says that that kind of truth is not true, right? When you talk about that being wiped away through the death of God, and he says truth as much as untruth being useful for life, I think that more of what he's talking about is appearance versus semblance and things such as that. Something I didn't talk about in my talk today, but that I wrote about in my thesis, is that he really praises Odysseus as being, he calls them an unscrupulous polytropoi, which basically means this wily little person who dances between appearance and deception for his own affirmation, right? And so Odysseus is true sometimes, Odysseus is untrue at other times, but whenever he is either, it's for the sake of his own affirmation. So that's how I would say that he defines truth. Beauty, I know that I talk about the artistic and the aesthetic phenomenon, but Nietzsche doesn't say the word beauty in 107, Aphorism, Our Ultimate Gratitude to Art, at all. Beautiful is not in. It's blissful, it's cheerful, it's joyful. It's not necessarily beautiful. And so I don't know, just in my preliminary studying of the gay science, how he would understand beauty, other than I know that it's not in the section where he talks about art. And then can you repeat your second question again?
Yeah. Is Nietzsche's philosophy both true and beautiful, according to Meredith Johnson?
I think that it's beautiful, and I think that it has some truth within our lives. Bridget.
So you talked about, like, with art needing to have a distance from it, in a sense, in order to, like, appreciate it and stuff. And I was just wondering if you could maybe talk about the difference between the artist and the person appreciating art. So, like, do they have a different experience, and what that experience would be?
Yes, I would definitely say so, because if we think about an artist creating art, if I'm an artist, I am willing whatever creation I see fit into this piece, right? But because outside truth does not exist and all it is our perception, if I go and put this thing over here and you go and walk up to it, you can see it as something different than what I intended it to be, correct? Because it's ultimately the creation of our own will in which we see and choose to see in this piece. And so it can be as true to me what I'm intended to paint as it can be your interpretation of what I've painted. And so in that way, you really see the importance of perspective in Nietzsche's thought, that I can see this thing that I've created from my own perspective, but then you can see it at the exact same time and see something completely different. I don't know if that, okay.
One final point.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Reminding me of Nietzsche's books and so on, that he seems to be a great lover of small children, and that we should somehow make ourselves like young kiddies
Mhm.
at the kindergarten or whatever, and just live life spontaneously. And he calls a child a self-propelled wheel that is free and happy and playing with blocks or whatever, and that's what a full and, what would you call it, joyous life would be for man as such, if he could get over his problems that are taking that spontaneity and kind of innocence. I suppose he wants us to recover our innocence, our child.
Mhm.
Children would be a step forward. We're so corrupt and nasty, I suppose.
Mhm.
Children aren't natively like that in the early days at least.
Yeah, I definitely think that that's a correct assessment of what he says. And at the end, whenever I talked about the aesthetic phenomenon, he did use the word childish in talking about exuberant, floating liberation. It is childish, it is childlike in the sense that it's imaginative, it's creative, it doesn't necessarily have to be true, it can be whatever you make it out to be. And it's like you said, it's innocent. It doesn't have preconceived notions about what the world may be that we might take in, like through a moral perspective or something. So I definitely think that childish and the element of imagination and play and dancing over is definitely part of this aesthetic phenomenon.